In 1936, the influx of German Jews to Palestine provoked yet another Arab protest known as the Great Arab Revolt. The Arabs now demanded an end to Jewish immigration and to any promise of statehood to the Jews. So the British set up a Royal Commission of Inquiry to re-examine the basis of the British mandate. In other words, they went back on their promise to the Jews. It was called the Peel Commission Partition Plan of 1937, and it came up with a radical solution: to partition Palestine into two separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, with Jerusalem to remain under British control. The Jews accepted the partition plan, but the Arabs rejected it altogether. It was to be the Arabs' first rejection of a two-state solution. This is important because, as you'll see, the Arabs have continually rejected the idea of a two-state solution, and in fact want a one-state solution with no Israel. The conflict today between Israel and her Arab neighbors is not territorial but existential. The Jews are fighting for their right to exist in the land that was given to them by God as an everlasting possession. So the British government decided to diffuse Arab anger by drastically curtailing Jewish immigration. They tried to prevent the Jews to whom the land belongs from immigrating at a time when they desperately needed their own homeland. In May 1939, Britain issued a British government policy document called the 1939 Palestine White Paper. It was Britain's intention that the Jews should never become a majority. Did you know that at the defeat of Germany in May 1945, as many as 100,000 survivors of the Holocaust wanted to live in Palestine? Britain, however, insisted on maintaining the pre-war restrictions on Jewish immigration. This led to Jewish resistance against the British Mandate authorities, and it intensified when the British decided to send more than 4,000 immigrants back to Germany on board the ship, the Exodus. The Exodus had been intercepted by British warships off the coast of Palestine. The Jews who had survived the Holocaust were being sent back to Germany by the British. Menachem Begin was one of those who led the Jewish resistance against the British Mandate authorities, as the Jews of Palestine were now desperate for a state of their own, especially after the horrors of the Holocaust. He was later to become one of Israel's prime ministers. The Jews of Palestine had even fought on the side of the British in World War I, yet the British had broken their promise to the Jews and had betrayed them in promising them a state of their own. The Jewish resistance was intended to break the resolve of the British to remain in Palestine, and it worked. By 1947, the British government had had enough. Britain had lost the will to maintain its power in Palestine, and on the 15th of February 1947, it announced that it was handing the mandate back to the United Nations. In that same year, on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, with Jerusalem to be an internationally administered area called a corpus separatum. On the day this resolution was passed, violent attacks on Jews began, and so the Jews began to initiate reprisals and fought back. In fact, this date is widely considered to be the start of the modern Arab-Israel conflict, with the passing of this UN partition resolution, which is called Resolution 181. During this time, the British struggled to maintain law and order before their withdrawal, which they announced would take place in May, 6 months after the resolution. Britain, unbelievably, still refused to allow the survivors of the Holocaust into Palestine. Meanwhile, war had broken out as Arabs attacked Jewish villages and towns, and Jews attacked the Arabs, with the result that within those 6 months, several thousand Jews and Arabs had been killed in fierce battles and reprisals. In the first week of May 1948, the British began to withdraw from Palestine. And then at 4 o'clock on the 14th of May 1948, in fulfillment of biblical prophecy, Israel's first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion read out the Proclamation of Independence and announced the establishment of the State of Israel. The first democracy in the Middle East had been born. The very next day after Israel's declaration of independence, the country was invaded by the combined armies of 7 Arab nations, in the Arabs' rejection again of a two-state solution. Their intention was to drive the Jews into the sea as they shouted, "Kill the Jews." Remember, this is just after the Holocaust, after more than 6 million Jews had just been murdered. Israel's War of Independence had begun, and it was to be the first in a series of wars known as the Arab-Israeli Wars. The effects of this first war are still felt today. This first war was actually in statistical terms the bloodiest of the Middle East wars, but it was a war that had to be won. The Jews were fighting for their survival. Even though they were vastly outnumbered, the Jews used improvised weapons and tactics and fought at their Arab attackers and won. Against all the odds, Israel was now a fait accompli in the Middle East. In July 1950, the law of return was passed in the Knesset in Israel's parliament, which gave the right to any Jew wishing to settle in Israel. And over the next 20 years, over 1 million Jews entered Israel under the law of return. After their attempt to destroy Israel in 1948 had failed, the Arab regimes resorted in the 1950s to a relentless campaign of terrorism across Israel's borders. It was with the intention of ending these deadly raids that Israel became involved in the next war in the Middle East, the 1956 Suez War. By 1956, Egypt had become the main center of power in the Arab world. When the United States withdrew its offer to fund the building of the Aswan Dam in Egypt, Egypt's President Nasser seized the Suez Canal on the 26th of July 1956. This nationalization of the Suez Canal sparked an international crisis. Britain and France were infuriated. The Suez Canal was a major strategic asset for Britain because most of its shipping passed through it. The canal was often called the lifeline of the British Empire. The United States tried to defuse the crisis through diplomacy, but Egypt rejected this. Britain and France refused to recognize Egyptian sovereignty over the canal. Israel accepted France's invitation to join in a tripartite attack on Egypt. Israel launched its Sinai campaign called Operation Kadesh on the 29th of October 1956, coordinating the attack with the British and French. Israel then captured the whole of the Sinai Peninsula within 100 hours, eliminating the Arab terrorist bases and bringing the Sinai under Israeli control as British and French paratroopers seized Port Said. The war ended in a total disaster for Egypt. Actually, the Suez War was a major diplomatic defeat for Britain and France, though. Both nations lost much of their influence in the Middle East, and many observers consider the Suez Crisis to be the last nail in the coffin of the British Empire. However, the Suez campaign proved to the Israelis that their reservist army could function in a full-scale military campaign. Now the United States and Soviet Union became the major powers in the region, with the result that after 1956, the Arab-Israel conflict became one of the most important frontiers of the Cold War. The Six-Day War of 1967 was a major turning point in the modern history of Israel. The Six-Day War of 1967 was one of the most remarkable conflicts in history. In just 6 days, the Israeli armed forces took on the might of the Arab world and won. The war was started when Egypt's President Nasser ordered the Egyptian army along the Suez zone to attack Israel and enforced a naval blockade to close off the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping. Other Arab nations were also mobilized to attack Israel. Rather than wait to be attacked, the Israeli Air Force carried out a series of preemptive strikes. These were carried out on the morning of the 5th of June 1967. The Israeli Air Force attacked the Arab air forces on the ground, and in just a few hours the Israeli Air Force had obtained air superiority as the Arab air forces were virtually wiped out. The Israeli Air Force could then give air support to Israeli ground forces. By the 7th of June, the Egyptian army was completely destroyed. Hundreds of twisted, burned-out tanks and trucks lay strewn across the Sinai Desert. Israel succeeded in capturing the West Bank, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula from the Arabs. And on the 7th of June, the Israeli army captured the old city of Jerusalem, with the result that there was now freedom of access to religious sites to all. The Six-Day War was a total disaster for the Arab world. It was also a massive blow to their morale. Even though it was a decisive victory for Israel, the war brought 600,000 Arabs under Israeli administration, and Israel's domestic policies now became a lot more complicated after the military successes of the Six-Day War. Between June 1968 and August 1970, a war of attrition was fought between Israel and forces of the Egyptian army and the PLO. It was started by Egypt as a way to force Israel to return the Sinai Peninsula, which had been captured by Israel in the Six-Day War, and also to lessen the severity of its defeat. However, this objective wasn't realized and hostilities ended with a ceasefire signed in 1970, with frontiers remaining in the same place as when the war began.